Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Does this sound all right? Great. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. My name is Drew Dameron, and I'm the library manager here at the Tokyo American Club. For tonight's TAC Talk, we're very happy to be hosting Mr. Timon Screech. Mr. Screech is a professor of the history of art at the School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS, at University of London. He's a specialist in the art and culture of early modern Japan. In 1985, Screech received a BA in Oriental Studies, Japanese specialization, at the University of Oxford. And in 1991, he completed his PhD in art history at Harvard University. Since graduating from Harvard, he has been at SOAS, and he has also been a visiting professor of art history at the University of Chicago and guest researcher at Gakushuen University and Waseda University in Tokyo. His main current research project is related to the early history of the English East India Company in Japan from 1613 to 23. And in July 2018, Screech was elected a Fellow of the British Academy, or FBA. Screech's leisure interests are Feli culture, urban gardening in Tokyo, and learning Burmese. We'll begin tonight's event with Mr. Screech's presentation, and then we'll open it up for questions from those attending in person and virtually. For those attending virtually, please feel free to use the Q&A function to submit your question, and then I'll pass them on to our speaker. After the Q&A, we'll have a book sale and signing to close out the event. And those attending virtually may also purchase a book to be signed, which can be picked up at the library later on when it's convenient for you. Finally, with the extension of the state of emergency, please note that we need to be intentional about wrapping up around 8 p.m. tonight. Thank you for your understanding and your cooperation. Please join me in welcoming Timon to our club.
Thank you very much. I'm far enough away from everyone, I think, that I can take off the mask. So it's a great pleasure. I've never had the thrill of speaking in this club before, though I've often been to the bar and met members. So it's really a great pleasure to be at this place. I also should thank the people who are not here tonight, those of you who are watching from other places. Everyone is very welcome. There are a few copies of the book. They've been going like hotcakes. I think there are only 4 copies left. So if anyone wants one desperately, please do. And my student, Shiori, is looking after the sales. And before I start, I should just say Shiori has just won a postdoctoral fellowship to Harvard. So she will be going there for next academic year. So that's an amazing, fantastic achievement. Well done. Yeah. my most successful student by a long way. So the book kind of has this hopefully attractive and appealing and rather curious title, The Shogun's Silver Telescope. No such telescope exists in Japan today, and the documentation relating to it is extremely scant. I came across it in a rather obscure footnote. The Shogun had received a telescope, and this really intrigued me. What is it? How did it come to be given? What was intended to mean by giving such a gift, and what did it mean? And over a course of many years, I kind of put together what I think is a plausible story, but I am aware that in the absence of much documentation, somebody can come up with a counter story, and we'll probably never have one single definitive answer to it. But at any rate, the clove was brought on this ship. Of course, this is a modern day model. We don't exactly know what the ship looked like, but it would have been an early 17th century English merchantman, which subsequently were called East Indiamen. In other words, they're for sailing long distances. You wouldn't use a ship like this going across to Boston, Massachusetts, or Virginia in those days. But still, it was for going around the Cape and all the way onto Japan. And it sailed in 1611. Now, it belonged to the East India Company, and those of you in Japan, which of course you all are, know very well about the history of the Dutch East India Company that traded with Japan right through from the early 17th century through until the Meiji period, mostly operating out of Nagasaki. But I beg to say that the English East India Company is older than the Dutch East India Company, even though the Dutch East India Company was more successful in the long run, in fact, probably in the short run too, in Japan. Now, one reason why this telescope was brought by the English is because the Dutch were already there. The English had to show in some way that they were different, better than the Dutch, but also different from the Spanish and the Portuguese, who similarly had been in Japan for quite a long time and were trading successfully. Now, the East India Company, certainly the English case, was set up to be a spice trading organization. The idea was to buy spices in the site of production, near the site of production, which would be much cheaper than buying them in Istanbul or in Venice. Shakespeare's play, The Merchant of Venice. If you wanted Asian things, you got them from Venice. Or if you were very experimental, you went all the way to Istanbul and Aleppo. But even there, of course, it was a long way from where they grew spices, and the Portuguese had already discovered you could go around the Cape of Good Hope and get to India. India doesn't make spices either, but if you go further along, you get basically to modern-day Java. And the English had been doing that since the creation of the company in 1601 was their first sailing. 10 years. But after a while, they think they can do more than this. If a ship is going from London to Bantam, nearby to modern-day Jakarta, then why doesn't it do a few other things on the way there? Stopping in India and stopping in Iran, for example, other islands around Southeast Asia. And of course, also then going on beyond Java to other places. And in Java, the English would have encountered Japanese people. And the Japanese people had something very important to tell them. And that was this. The English want to get spices. But of course, they can't steal them. They need to buy them with something. So they bought them with stolen Spanish silver. It was totally legitimate because England and Spain were at war. They would capture so-called plate ships, ships with plata, coming back from Latin America. But then the English and the Spanish conclude peace, and this is not a viable option anymore. They can buy Spanish silver, but that, of course, ruins the balance of payments. So they need to buy the spices with something else. And England had one world-class export product at that time, which was woolen cloth. And it was sold to many places around the world already. So they turn up in Java with a ship of woolen cloth, and the Javanese say, beautiful cloth, we love it, but are you aware it's 35 degrees outside? We don't need pullovers and socks made of wool. They say, well, we'll buy some. They will be fairly useful as elephant covering, but that won't really be very much. This is where the Japanese say, we live in a country that has very cold winters, and we don't have any sheep. So the English feel that this is the way to go. So voyages to Japan become envisaged from about the year 1610. And the ships will go, excuse me if you probably this is obvious to you, but sailing from around the Cape of Good Hope is not very difficult, and you come here to Java. But amazingly, there's only two ways through from the Indian Ocean through to the South China Sea. It's actually really hard to get through this last bit. The spices themselves are grown through here, but they can be purchased on Java. And the Portuguese had already taken Malacca, and it's a very long strait, right? So if your enemies have that, they'll just have forts along the way, and there's no possibility of you ever getting through. So the non-Portuguese and Spanish had no chance. It was the Dutch who first made contact with the Sultan of Bantam, and he was very enthusiastic about their trade. The English came along too, and so there's a second way of getting through. And having got through here, then of course sailing up to Japan is relatively speaking easy. And so the ship goes to Japan. 3 sailed from London, the Thomas, the Hector, but only the Clove was the one that went on alone to Japan. Now, of course, that was our map. I took it from Google, but their maps, their conceptualization of the world was a little bit different. Nevertheless, Java, you don't dare go through there, go on through, and you come up to Japan. If this is the map that you're envisaging the world through, 2 things will immediately strike you. First of all, why go all the way around here where you can go over the top of Russia? And so the voyages to Japan will always predicate on the fact that before very long, a ship will be able to go from London to Nagasaki or Edo over the top of Russia. And I have one of the little quotes at the very beginning of my book, the epigram. The professor of mathematics at Oxford says, "I'm pretty sure that before I die, I can write a letter in May in Oxford and it'll arrive in China before the end of the summer." Should be possible. Of course, we know those seas are frozen all throughout the year. Well, maybe they're not anymore, but they were frozen throughout the year. You can't get a ship through. But also, second error, Siberia doesn't exist on this map. Once Siberia is factored in, it's actually not much quicker going over the top of Russia. And third error that this map would inculcate is look at the size of Japan compared with the size of India. Japan was regarded as so astronomically enormous that it could absorb any amount of English wool that was sent there. Now, Japan doesn't make spices, but Japan has silver, right? Today it doesn't, but about a third of all the silver ever mined on Earth has come out of Japan. So the East India Company thinks we'll sail to Japan over the top of Russia, should probably only take about 6 weeks. We'll swap our wool for the Japanese silver. We'll take the silver down to Java. The Javanese are accustomed to selling spices for silver, and there was wonderful triangulation. And we can do the whole thing over Russia. We don't even have to ever meet any Spanish and Portuguese. This was the plan. To make it all work, they need Japanese agreement, and therefore you need one rather fine present, something to endear yourself. King James I was behind this. He'd, of course, become King of England in 1603, coming down from Scotland, and he's often regarded as the most intelligent English king after Henry VIII. Some people say the only intelligent English king after Henry VIII. But in any case, he was a person of considerable interest in geography, in astronomy, in politics. And he was behind the idea that it was interesting in its own right, never mind the finances, to get to the end of the world. And a letter in his name, whether he personally drafted it, we don't know, a letter in his own name was put on this ship, beautiful illuminated thing, addressed to the Emperor of Japan and sent off. They didn't have too much of a clear idea who the Emperor of Japan might be, but it figured that Japan had to have some magnificent ruler of some kind. It wasn't the figure that today we think of the Emperor, who almost all Europeans regard as the Japanese Pope, which is not a bad idea for what he was at that time. When they say emperor, the executive government, they always, of course, mean the shogun. And it was Tokugawa Ieyasu, technically in retirement, but still effectively the shogun, and he would be the one that would receive the telescope. Sadly, the records of the Privy Council, the king's own council, relating to the period before the dispatch of the clove are missing. Equally, the records of the East India Company in London, although they're extremely well preserved, there's almost a mile of documents. The months before the departure of the clove are lost, which is very frustrating. We just don't know who said, let's send a telescope, nor what they thought it would mean by it. But it arrived in Japan. It was taken from the port city in Kyushu up to what today we call Shizuoka. They called it Sumpu, where Tokugawa Ieyasu was living in notional retirement. His son Hidetada was, formally speaking, shogun living in Edo Castle. And Ieyasu received it. The Japanese records simply state that people from a country called England brought in the name of their king a object for seeing things at great distance. And the Japanese add what the English accounts don't specify the size of it. And it was about 3 meters long. So it was a big thing, right? Of course, telescopes at the time were rather large, but this was a extremely big one, even by the standards of the time, and silver gilt. The title of my book says the silver telescope. It was silver gilt, actually. So it would have looked gold, because silver, of course, tarnishes very fast, but gold is too soft to make an instrument out of. Silver gilt was a very standard royal level gift for people around Europe at the time, but not a telescope. This is the first telescope that was ever made in silver gilt, the first telescope ever made to be a royal level gift, and the first telescope ever to leave Europe. Ieyasu got hold of it, and the records of the donation of the instrument state that there was, as well as the kind of representative of the English crown, there was an Englishman you may have heard of already living in Japan. He'd come on a Dutch ship called William Adams. William Adams had pretty good spoken Japanese at this point, and the English representative says that he was asked to leave the room, and Adams remained with Ieyasu for several hours. And what were they talking about? Who knows? But it must have been something about what is this amazing instrument? What can it do? What are the purposes of it? This all happened in Shizuoka, in those days called Sumpu. The castle burnt down quite early in the Edo period, but parts of it have been restored. And the telescope, I was looking for it for quite a long time until everyone told me, forget it. You can't hide a 3-meter long telescope made of silver gilt. If you can't find it, it's because it's lost. Something happened to it over time. It doesn't exist anymore, but it was there that the exchange took place. Ieyasu says, well, I'm in charge. My son is technically speaking Shogun, so you must go to Edo Castle and meet him too. He will receive another gift from you. Fortunately, they brought another one, also silver gilt, but it was a big, beautiful goblet, appropriate for the Shogun, but not a telescope. And in response, they get something back. But the telescope was the key. This is a replica of the one that Galileo used. Of course, he was a scientist. It's just a plain wooden thing. It doesn't look fancy. It's not supposed to be a gift. But Ieyasu received his telescope then 1613, just a few years after Galileo's findings for the telescope had been published. And Galileo, of course, was working in Italy, but the publication of his book was immediately notified to King James I. In fact, King James I received the first 2 copies, other than the one that had been given to the Medici dukes who had sponsored Galileo's work. So immediately across to England, this is known, and a telescope was shown to King James I in 1609, and then in 1611, just as the Clovis sailors Japan, London's biggest annual festival was, and perhaps still is, the Lord Mayor's Show. Right? London has a new Lord Mayor every year, and the Lord Mayor comes in and does a very fancy show. It happens in October. And that year, the Lord Mayor's Show was built around the object of a telescope. They created in London a huge kind of artificial mountain, which they called Mount Triumphant, and all the virtues as people, right, were emblematically around the mountain, showing commerce and justice and vigilance and all the things the London merchants like to think that they emblematized. And at the top of it was truth. And truth was there looking at the stars through a telescope. At which point a cart labeled error turned up, and truth looked through the telescope at it, and error fled and burst into fireworks. It was an amazing, thrilling thing for the people of London to see. But what they would have understood is that when you say error, you mean the Roman Catholic Church. Sorry if there's any devout Roman Catholics in the room. At this time, of course, there's great struggles between the Church of England, newly formed, and the Roman Catholic Church. And so the telescope there is standing for a kind of new understanding. Now, I should say that, of course, what Galileo found through the telescope was quite tentative at this time, and a telescope was nothing like a modern one. It wasn't like it proved anything, but the telescope stood for a kind of modern way of thinking, unencumbered by traditional habits about the way that the world was. I think that's what the object was supposed to mean. The English were, as a result, given permission to open a trading station, and there were many debates about where exactly this should be opened. The general consensus that it should be somewhere near to Edo. After all, that's where the center of power was, and somewhere around Uraga, which is where 3.5 centuries later, Perry would go. It's an obvious place to land. But in the end, they decided that sailing up from Southeast Asia, which is what they did, they're better off in Kyushu. And so they opened their trading station just as the Dutch had done, not in Nagasaki because that was filled with Roman Catholic priests and Spanish and Portuguese, but just around the corner in Hirado. So there we see, it's, sorry, rather dim slide, but this is Hirado Bay with very scant houses. And here is the English trading station at the top with the flag of St. George. To thank the King James for his letter and for the silver gilt goblet that the Shogun himself had received, the reciprocal gift, sorry, I'll come back to that if I've got time. The reciprocal gift was a pair of suits of armor. And these were taken back to London, and one of them was put in the Tower of London, and it's never left. It sat there, recently been restored, and looks very grand. The other suit of armor the king liked so much, he kept it in his own palace, which in those days was what's now King James's, St. James's Palace in London. And the room was equipped, the palace was equipped with what he called the Indian chamber. But the records seem to suggest that all the objects in it were actually Japanese. That suit of armor was sold off by Oliver Cromwell during the Commonwealth period when the royal collection was sold. But when the royal family was restored to the throne after the Commonwealth period, the king invited everyone who had looked after his objects so nicely when after Mr. Cromwell, we were invited to return them. So these objects came back, and they're back in the royal collection today, including that second suit of armor. The Tokugawa Ieyasu, notionally in retirement, had received the telescope. So of course he must give something too, and he gave 5 pairs of gold screens. And now you all know, of course, living in Japan, these gold screens, they're dramatic objects. They're very large. Each leaf is the size of a person from those days, and they always come in pairs. So this is this is 8 leaves, right? Today they're usually only 6, but they could be 8, 12. It would be from here pretty much to that curtain, the space it would take. Gold. And that's the Japanese just say gold, but the English records say that they were covered with gorgeous paintings. We don't know who made them, and as an art historian, of course, I'd love to know, can we attribute an artist's name to these objects? They don't survive in England, so the truth of the matter is we can't, but very likely it was an artist from the Kano school. Kano would dominate formal Japanese painting all the way through the Edo period, and the great Kano master who Ieyasu is known to have liked at the time was called Kano Takanobu. So very likely they were his work, but we can't say more than that. The East India Company, realizing that the king was about to receive 5 pairs of gorgeous Japanese screens, twigged that other people would want some too. So they also bought a number of screens on the open market in Japan, which they hoped to sell for a large amount of money when the ship got home. And so with permission to trade, with reciprocal gifts from the shogun and the shogun's father, and with this grand document, which I bleeped over, but I'll go back to it, the Shuinjo, the Vermilion Seal letter, which gives authorization to the English to trade anywhere in Japan. The Dutch had received a very similar one, and can you read these things? Ingressen, right? And it's signed by, and here it was also Inglaterra, right, to England, signed by Ieyasu. When it got to England, nobody knew what the hell this thing was, so they didn't know what on earth to do with it. Oxford University had just built a new library at this time at the beginning of the 17th century, so they put it there, and it got lost for 300 years. Nobody knew what it was, and it came to light in Oxford University Library only about 15 years ago. A replica of it now is in the British Embassy here. So it all looks like things are going very well. The East India Company had also brought back a large amount of Japanese lacquer. This was a purely commercial decision on their part. It had nothing to do with royal exchange, but lacquer was already very popular in Europe, and the Spanish and the Portuguese had already brought a lot out. It had gone all around the Habsburg. Of course, the King of Spain is Habsburg, so all over German castles in Austria and Hungary, they have Japanese lacquer, and it's very, very highly admired. And so it's brought to London and is sold. Interesting enough, the very first ever art auction held in English history was lacquer from the clove from Japan. And that was in December 1614, just after the ship got back. We have a list of the lacquer objects that were sold, we have a list of the prices, and we have the names of the people who bought it, which is quite an extraordinary fact. Shortly after that, there was the sale of the screens, not the one the king had got, but the ones the king got, but the ones to be sold. And again, we have the titles of the objects. It says screens filled with horses, screens with battles, screens of fowl, in other words, birds, a range of subjects which are typical for Japanese formal art of the period. Again, we have the prices and we have the names of the buyers. And several of the buyers can be pegged against quite significant people in English history at that time. The prices ranged quite broadly. It may be to do with whether the screens had got damaged en route or how colourful they were. Maybe a screen of horses was regarded as more refined and therefore more expensive than a screen with pictures of birds on it. Who knows? But the best ones went for about £10. And although screens are in pairs, they sell each half separately. So that meant a screen pair was about £20. Now, you could buy a Caravaggio in London for £15 at the time. So these things were treated as very significant works of art. They weren't just sort of silly exotica. Regrettably, they don't survive. A screen hung up in a Western kind of, pinned on the wall like you would an oil painting, it'll fall apart very rapidly. So it's gone. Again, they're gone. The ones that the king received, again, were sold off by Cromwell, but at the end of the Commonwealth period, when the king invited people to return his objects, clearly they'd fallen apart so much, they were not returned. But lacquer survives well. And although nothing can be found amongst the successors of any of the original purchasers, one is today in Hatfield House outside London. If you go to London as a tourist, you might well want to go to Hatfield House. The house is virtually unchanged since it was built in about 1610, and the owners are still living in it, and the original owner was a big sponsor of the East India Company. So very plausibly, this is an object back from the Clove. I'm coming to the end of my time, but just a couple more points, if I may. The East India Company would go on to trade with Japan for a decade. A decade is not very long. The Dutch, after all, traded for 350 years. The problem was that they realized there is no route over the top of Russia. They also realized that although Japan has no wool, no woolen clothing, and Japan does have cold winters, not this year, we've been lucky, but still, it wasn't as if the Japanese were just shivering until somebody turned up with wool for them. There was perfectly good Japanese winter clothing. In fact, as soon as the English have their first winter in Japan, the first thing they do is get rid of their woolen clothing and start using Japanese cloth instead. The Japanese say, you're not even wearing it yourselves. How do you think we will? But in fact, we will buy it to cover horses with. So English wool on the whole is used as horse covers and also covers for wrapping up swords and halberds and pieces of armor. You may know about these tabards, jinbaori, that you wear over the top of armor. You can't use silk for that, it'll tear. But wool is very good, and quite a lot of surviving Japanese military surcoats are made of wool, whether it's English wool or Dutch wool or something else, we don't know. The main trade was silver, and that seems to have worked quite well. Wool going to Japan worked reasonably well too, but the company also brings all kinds of trinket type objects. Occasionally screens, but of course they are very expensive. Occasionally lacquer, but not such fancy things as this. Guess what? They start commissioning Japanese lacquer beer tankards. They also bring back spoons, and there are also folding fans, not lacquered, silk of all kinds, bits and bobs like that. And they don't go for big auctions. They're sold in an institution set up for the purpose called the New Exchange. Next time, if you go to London, you probably go to Charing Cross, just beside Trafalgar Square, which in those days was the very end of London. Beyond that, there were fields, and then the second city of Westminster, at the very edge of London, but near to Westminster, where the courtiers, who were, of course, very wealthy, lived. they built this thing called the New Exchange. And today, Topshop is exactly on the spot. The modern day building is made to look a bit like a replica of a Jacobean building. And it doesn't look like this. In the end, they had to scale down the plans. This is just too crazy. But there's a little street there called today Exchange Court. And in this, the Japanese objects were sold. It was built by the Earl of Salisbury, who was the one who also built Hatfield House, where that piece of lacquer I showed you probably came from. Well, to finish up, the person who took this suit of armor, the person who took the ship out with the telescope and who came back with these gifts was called John Cyrus. He got involved with a lot of contraband. He did what they called private trade. He got into big trouble with the company for bringing back rather too much in his own private trunks. But he was very rich as a result of what happened. He married the daughter of a very wealthy London merchant. She sadly died in childbirth, and he never remarried, which is a bit unusual for the time. Instead, he went to live in what was in those days the beautiful and affluent suburb of Fulham. And his grave is still there. The grave, unfortunately, is rather bashed about, as you can imagine, after 400 years. But I was able to find this crest, and by consultation with the College of Heralds, we came up with this is what his actual family coat of arms was. A rather strange one, but that's what he was. Now his grave, Cyrus then wrote a book of his experiences in Japan, and the book was published and dedicated to Francis Bacon, right? Francis Bacon, who was Lord Chancellor and wrote the Book of Essays, right? Francis Bacon was one of the great, what you might call political philosophers of the early 17th century. And how fascinating to think that he had actually read a book all about Japan. So one thing I want to do in my book, and I hope that if you have a chance to read it, you'll pick this up from it, is that of course the East India Company was a commercial organization. They needed to balance the books. The subsequent history of the East India Company would also be extremely shameful with slave trading and exploitation. But in this early period, it's very intriguing that they want to do more than just sell stuff. They actually want to find out about places the other side of the globe. And if you were somebody from Amsterdam, even Lisbon, certainly London, that found themselves in Edo in 1615 or so, you'd have been overwhelmed, right? The last thing you thought of doing was colonization and exploitation and killing people. No way, you know, you're encountering societies which are so much superior to your own, which you realized. And when King James I was told of the state of the Shogun and of his grandeur, he left a comment in the marginalia, which is recorded there in his own handwriting, saying, "I've never heard the loudest lies I've ever heard." He couldn't bring himself to accept it. So that's it. Thank you very much for listening. And I think there's time for questions over to you.
Definitely. Thank you. Thank you, Tim. Any questions for Mr. Screech?
You mentioned there was a place in Shizuoka that was Simpu.
Yes.
Where is Shimpu supposedly today?
So Simpu is the old name for Shizuoka. It's just the same. But the castle, which is now rebuilt, carries the old name. So it's still called Simpu Castle rather than be called Shizuoka Castle. But if you get out of the train at Shizuoka Station, the castle is just 5-10 minute walk.
Oh, wow.
Away from you, yes.
Okay.
And Ieyasu died there. So as you all know, of course, he was buried at Nikko. I hope you've all been, amazing place. But before his body was moved to Nikko, he was buried in Shizuoka. And so his grave there is also very much worth seeing as well.
Thank you very much indeed. Much enjoyed reading your book and learnt a lot. One thing that really puzzled me, though, was on what did the early investors in the East India Company base their decision to invest in a voyage to Japan? And to what extent was there really good quality intelligence on which to base the decision to make such a significant investment as they collectively did at the time? And how good was that intelligence, and where did that intelligence come from?
Thank you. It's a great question. Once you're in Java, it's not that much of a big deal to go up to Japan. I mean, in other words, London to Java is going to take you'd leave London about now, March, April or so, and you expect to arrive into Java in December, and then you'd overwinter, and the winds will only bring you to Japan in about summer. So it's not so hard. They were worried about the Philippines because, of course, that was Spanish territory. But after the peace, so long as they don't seek to land there, the Spanish won't attack ships going through. Because we've lost the East India Company records and the royal records from immediately before, we don't know. The East India Company is very good at, they had meetings and they were minuted, and they would have said, we were talking about this, somebody said this, but the records are gone. There were plenty of records sent back by missionaries. I mean, the English, of course, were often too prejudiced to want to learn anything from the Spanish and the Portuguese, but they could have found details if they'd chosen to. In terms of the dividends, when the clove came back, it was like 300% profit. So it made sense to do it. And that was with Cyrus having siphoned off quite a lot for himself. So these voyages were commercially viable. The danger they have is that each voyage is independently subscribed to. So if your voyage happens to go down and the next voyage comes back, it's arbitrary. So they then create a joint stock so that nobody suffers unduly from any one voyage's success or failure. Yeah. So follow up? Talk loud, I can probably hear you. Yes. 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 Okay, so their belief is that, well, it's true, Japan has got lots of silver. And the Javanese, anywhere in the world, people will buy things with silver. It's a commodity that's understood worldwide. So if you get lots of silver, it's great. The only other place to get silver is Latin America, which the Spanish control. So they're going to Japan for one reason only, really, which is to get silver. And how are they going to get it? Well, they'll get it with the only thing that England really has to sell, which is wool. And because Japan is cold and they think it's very big and it has no sheep, they think it's all going to work very nicely. Yeah.
Hello. Thank you very much. Fascinating discussion. I'm curious, what was the fate of the English trading colony in Gerardo?
I'm sorry, missed the end of the question.
What was the fate of the English trading company that was established in Gerardo?
Yes, so it's a branch of the East India Company, and they think it's going to become the most lucrative of them all. It didn't work out that way for the reasons I said. Japan didn't need wool. You can't go to the top of the Russia, but so by the time you're going all the way around the south, it's a very, very long and tedious voyage. So the trading station in Japan closed after a decade. 1613 it was established, 1623 it closed down. They also pulled out of Siam, modern-day Thailand, at the same time, and they concentrate really on spice trade. And then after the Civil War and the return of the crown, the King of England married the Catherine of Braganza, the daughter of the King of Portugal, and she brought us her dowry, Bombay. So that's where the English get into India, and there's no point in going all the way to Japan anymore.
Thank you. I've got a question from online here. This is from Mr. Frank Packard. Hello, Timon. Ohisashiburi.
Hello, Frank.
Please tell us more about William Adams and the telescope in Ieyasu.
Okay. Well, William Adams is a whole other story. He, famously the first English person in Japan. He arrived in 1600, so before the East India Company in England or in Holland has even been created. He came in a Dutch ship. So it was a kind of one-off Dutch voyage, quite a large one, that went the other way past Chile, Latin America. And almost all the ships were lost, but one ship called the Liefde, the Charity, made it to Japan. And William Adams, although he was by no means the commander, but he was one of the pilots. In other words, he was good at navigation, and he happened to be in good health on arrival of the ships. Almost all the other people were too sick to say anything. And William Adams was, well, of course, the Jesuits, of course, tried to have him killed as a northern heretic. But Ieyasu decided not to have him killed. He was rather interested that this is somebody from a different perspective, right? The Spanish and the Portuguese have been telling him things for a long time. He had no reason to disbelieve what he was being told, but now there's somebody who will tell something different. And William Adams, as a young man, had even been part of he hadn't fought at the Spanish Armada, but he'd been at the Spanish Armada. So he has a few rather strong views about Spain and its aggressiveness. And that's how Adams came in. He began in the Dutch employment, but his contract had long expired. He remained in Japan, and so he started to work for the English East India Company for a while. And a little nugget, I don't know how many of you love Okinawa. I do. And Adams made the first voyage to Ryukyus and brought back with him potatoes. And the first potatoes ever planted in Japan were planted in the English East India Company's garden. Yeah. He also brought back the first bottle of awamori that Ieyasu is known to have drunk.
Hi, Timon. Yes, it's Chris Wells. Actually, Frank's question was asked, and I put my hand up before that.
Sorry about that.
So no, it's fine. But it's kind of inevitable that we would end up on the topic of William Adams. His remains have been recently established,
yes,
as definitely been found. Is there any prospect of those being reunited with the site in Nihonbashi, which is obviously
yes,
very close to here and would be potentially
yes,
very fitting
yes,
place for them to be put?
Yeah, thank you very much. So just to clarify the picture, Adams was given land in Miura Hanto, right? And his son was called Miura Anjin as a result. Adams died, however, because he was doing his trade on his own. He died in Hirado, and there's a spot which is always said to be Adams's grave, and family living next door to it actually still called Miura, and they claim that they're descendants, and everyone thought was kind of a tall story, but the excavation was carried out, and they turned up a body which is, after DNA analysis and such things, is definitely a North European aged about 45 who died about 1620. In other words, he's not Iberian. There would have been Iberian burials around there as well. Thank you very much. You've been eating Japanese food for 10 years, which also rules out any kind of sailor or something, and it rules out, there's no Dutch person known to fit these criteria. So about 99% sure this is Adams's body. There's not much of it left, a few bones. I don't know what the intention is to do with the remainder of it. He had a house in Nihonbashi as well, and right near Mitsui Bank in Nihonbashi, there's a little street called Anjin-dori, right? And there's a little marker there, supposedly where Adams's house was. And we did approach Mitsui, that own that most of the land, if they would like to sponsor some kind of commemoration, and they said they'd be very interested to do that. So then we contacted Chuoku, asked them if they'd be interested, and they said they were absolutely not interested at all, and they would forbid it. So we won't. I'm afraid to say the answer is an emphatic no. But Hirado's quite keen to hang on to the because, of course, it'll be a big tourism pull for them.
Thank you. We've got time for one more question.
Oh, sorry, my answers are too long and rambling.
Maybe, yeah, just to end, could you just talk just a little bit about the process of actually writing the book and any of the things that were challenging in putting it together?
Okay, thank you. It was very challenging because, if I'm anything, I'm a historian of Japan, and this is a kind of about English history, and I'd never done any English history since I was at school, so it was a steep learning curve. Of course, being used to studying Japanese history, the great thing about English history is that all the documents are written in English. It makes it so much easier, actually. And then I had to also learn something about the history of science, because what telescopes are, what they meant, what they didn't mean. So I was trying to cover more fields than I really felt comfortable with. Of course, I was helped a lot by experts in those various areas. But what happened first, honestly, was that Cyrus's journal, which I mentioned, I read it, and there's tucked away in a little bottom thing is about this telescope, and that's extraordinary, telescope so early on. It's still got, so that was my starting point. Why a telescope, what it meant, and I just tried to read as widely around the topic as I could. And still in the days when you took notes on pieces of paper, I got like a meter high of A4 notes that went into writing it. The book was originally very much longer because I traced the whole voyage. Now, as it is, it talks about leaving England and then arriving in Japan. But of course, it stopped at many places along the way, and I wanted to trace that story, but I wasn't able to. But things that were left out of that book hopefully can be recycled at some other publication in the future.
Thank you very much. And thank you for your questions too. If you could all join me in thanking Mr. Screech again one last time.